Hey everyone, in this video we're going to work through the chapter 29 story in the Ecce Romani textbook. So before we dive into the translation, like I always tell you, you got to make sure that you've got the vocab under control. There's a decent vocab list in this chapter. It's not too overwhelming, so just make sure you've memorized it, that you feel comfortable with all the words. Look at any English derivatives you can to start to associate these words with words you might know in English, just so you feel really comfortable as you translate and that you can read it without having to always stop and look at the dictionary. The second thing you want to do is make sure you've got the grammar under control. So this grammar is going to be on indefinite adjectives and interrogative pronouns, and then the book is going to kind of do a recap for you of all the QU words that you've seen. So basically all these different words that start with QU. At this point, you've seen 5 different versions, so it can be a little overwhelming. So we're going to stop and kind of go back and just make sure that it all makes sense to you so we can translate. And again, you want to read through the book, read through your notes. Feel free to watch my grammar video, whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that you feel comfortable with it and that you're not being tripped up by these as you read through the story. The last thing you want to do is make sure that you find a partner from class, anyone who can work with you on this, and read the story aloud to them. Work on your pronunciation, read the story to them, and then have them read it back to you. I always say this, but it's the best way to make sure that you're understanding the story, and you're going to catch the patterns as you go by hearing it, speaking it too. You don't want to shut off those two forms of learning and just read the story in your head. You want to make sure that you're actually reading it aloud and treating it like the language it is. It's a good way to make sure that you're catching the patterns, and it's just going to help you overall with your reading skills. So once you've done all that and feel in a pretty good place, you're ready to move through the story. So before we dive in too far, though, I want to make sure that the grammar is under control for you, because it is a little tricky, and it will trip you up if you try to read the story and understand it without having a good grasp of the grammar. So like I mentioned before, the first grammar topic is indefinite adjectives. So these sound complicated. They're really not. It's basically an adjective used to describe someone that you're not sure about, right? Someone you don't know or something that you're vague on. So in other words, we translate it as a certain is usually how your book would tell you to translate it. I think some works a little bit better in more modern English, but whatever makes sense to you, go with that. But an example would be if you said, I gave the ball to some kid. Right? When I describe the kid as some kid, I'm saying I don't know who that person was. If I knew that the kid's name was, Sally or Sammy or whatever, I would have used their name. I don't know this person. So I want to describe the person, but I really don't know who they are. That's why it's called an indefinite adjective. You're really not sure about them. So you can use it as a certain, some, however you want. In the story, we've seen it in regards to the merchant. I believe it was in last chapter. Aurelia says, I'm going to some merchant, right? It implies that she doesn't know this person. Maybe she's been there before, but she doesn't know this merchant's name, or maybe she's just heard about this merchant, right, and doesn't know this person herself. Either way, that's where you use an indefinite adjective. So they're actually really easy to spot in Latin. They look just like relative pronouns, so you're going to notice a lot of, qui and quae and quibus and all these things you've seen before, but they have the ending dam on the end of them. So instead of qui, you're going to say see quidam. So it'll stand out to you as being an indefinite adjective just because it's kind of a unique ending and something that really does stand out from the other QU words we've seen so far. So this is what I'm referring to. This is a chart of your indefinite adjectives. And like I said, you're going to notice, for instance, in the masculine singular column, you start with the stem of qui, cuius, cui, quem, quo. The one tweak is in the accusative. We switch the M to an N, but otherwise they look just like relative pronouns. But the DAM on the end of it is really giving it away as being an indefinite adjective. It's a unique ending that'll stand out. So you should never really have a problem with spotting these just because they look so familiar. The other thing that we're learning in this chapter's grammar is interrogative pronouns. And again, nothing too crazy here. The name interrogative kind of gives it away. You're asking a question. Think about if you're interrogating someone, you're asking them questions. But it really comes from the verb rogare in Latin, which means to ask. So these are question words. They're pronouns that start questions. So in English, the most common ones we see are who and what, right? You usually use who when you're referring to a person and what when you're referring to a thing. Just like indefinite adjectives, these interrogative pronouns also look very similar to relative pronouns. So this is why we're going to review the QU words. They're all starting to kind of feel and look the same. But they're going to come at the beginning of a question. So they're pretty easy to spot because if you know someone's asking a question, the QU word, the interrogative pronoun here, is going to come at the beginning. So that'll give it away as being an interrogative pronoun. The one thing you want to think about when you're deciding what interrogative pronoun to use, think about the case, number, and gender. So in other words, if I'm referring to, say, a girl and I'm saying, whose is this, right? If I know I'm talking to a group of girls, I would use the feminine gender. If it's a group of boys, I'd use the masculine gender. So you want to make sure that you've got that case, number, and gender element down too. But otherwise, they're pretty straightforward, right? They look like this. This is the chart, and they're pretty easy because they're asking questions. So even though they look familiar, right, to relative pronouns, you have quis, quis, qui, quem, quo. It's still easy to spot them because they will start the beginning of a question, like I've been saying. So don't get too tripped up. Just think about what they are and try to recognize them at the beginning of a question, and you should be fine. And again, if you look over to the right, you can see the translation. They mean basically who, right? So who, whose, to, or for whom, and down the line. And if you're referring to a thing, you'd say what. So now that we've kind of processed those two, we do want to take a step back and think about all the QU words that you've seen so far. Because at this point in the textbook, you've seen 5 different categories, and they really do look very familiar, but they're doing different things. So the first thing you want to reboot is relative pronouns. And again, these are kind of the most basic ones we've seen so far in terms of QU words, but they're easier to spot than you might think because they're going to be in a relative clause, which usually means they're going to have commas around them. But what you're really looking for here is when you see a QU word like qui, quai, quo, whatever it is, if it's referring back to something in the sentence, in other words, it has an antecedent, you're going to recognize it as being a relative pronoun. And again, especially if what you're reading has the commas around it, which almost always happens, they're going to be very easy to spot because you're seeing a QU word that's starting a clause. It's a subordinate clause. It has the commas around it. You're going to recognize it as being a relative pronoun. The indefinite adjectives, like I said, they have the DAM ending. Once you see that word that looks like a relative pronoun but has a DAM ending, you know it's an indefinite adjective. Pretty easy to spot. Interrogative pronouns, again, they come at the beginning of a question. So if you see a QU word at the start of a question, it's an interrogative pronoun. Then we have 2 that we're going to discuss now. You've seen these before. We haven't really spoken too much about them. But you have what's called the causal conjunction, which is the word quote, right? It's a conjunction, meaning it's joining 2 clauses together. And it means because. We've seen this a lot. But quote can also be a relative pronoun. Here's the trick. When you have quote on its own, you want to look to see if it has an antecedent. So in other words, the 2 options it could be are either the word because, the conjunction, or a relative pronoun. If it were a relative pronoun, quote would be neuter, right? So if there's no neuter word in front of quote that it could be referring to, in other words, if there's no neuter antecedent, you know that it's not a relative pronoun, it just means because. So it takes a little bit of thinking, but it's not as bad as you might think because, again, you know that it would have to be neuter, and if there's no neuter word in front of it for it to be referring back to, it's not a relative pronoun, it would have to be meaning quote. And you'll get used to it the more of those you see. The last QU word we're looking at is the exclamatory adverb, quam. It's called exclamatory because it's got the exclamation point after it. You're exclaiming something, shouting something, however you want to think about it. So it's pretty easy to spot because it usually comes at the beginning of a sentence and it's going to have the exclamation point after it, right? It's always spelled quam. So if it were a relative pronoun, again, you'd be looking for some sort of feminine, probably accusative, singular relative pronoun. So if you know that, just look around. It's going to be at the beginning of the sentence though, so you're not going to really get confused. But if you want to ever double check, just look and recognize, wow, there's no feminine word for this to refer to. It has to be an exclamatory adverb. And it just means how. Okay, so this is kind of a quick list of how you can tell them apart. If you practice this, it's probably easier than writing all these down and kind of thinking about all 5 as you go. But feel free to just have them somewhere nearby. So when you run into the QU words, particularly in the story, you're kind of getting a sense of what they are. I'll point them out as we do the translation. But the more you practice, the easier this becomes, and you won't really have to think about it too much. So this, you're ready to dive in now onto, this is a typo here, don't mind this, but now you're ready to dive into the chapter 29 story. And like I said, I'm going to highlight it by cases, and I'm going to point out where the QU words are. So this is continuing the story from last chapter where Aurelia has taken Cornelia. They're getting carried through the city and they're going to the merchant, right? They're going to go on their trip to the merchant to buy the dormice. So it starts with Cornelia summa celeritate se paravit. So remember, Aurelia in the last chapter had just told Cornelia to get ready and meet her at the atrium. So it starts by saying Cornelia se paravit. She prepared herself summa celeritate, with the greatest speed. So in other words, she's getting ready to go out with her mom, which is exactly what Aurelia told her to do. Then we have brevi tempore, mater et filia a servis per urbem ferebantur. So in a short time, right, brevi tempore, or soon, you could say, the mother and daughter, meaning Aurelia and Cornelia, they were being carried, ferebantur, it's imperfect passive. So they were being carried per urbem, through the city. Remember, per always goes with an accusative, which is why we have urbem, the accusative noun. So when you have the passive voice verb, you're looking for that ablative of agent. So in other words, who's carrying them? It's a servis. There's the ablative of agent. They're being carried by slaves. So to put it all together again, you're saying soon or in a short time, the mother and daughter were being carried by slaves through the city, meaning they're off and on their way to the merchant. And now we continue on. You have in vis era ingens multitudo hominum. So in the streets or in the roads, again, it's ablative plural because you're saying inside or on the roads, you could say. There's not really that movement involved. There was in ingens multitudo, a huge crowd. Hominum is genitive plural. So you're saying there was a huge crowd, a huge multitude, you could say, of people, meaning there's a lot of people in the street, which makes total sense. You have concursaban enim servi, milites, viri, mulieres. So concursaban means they were running back and forth, right? We need a subject, though. Who was running back and forth? And enim here means for. You could translate for because. It's explaining why there's a huge crowd. So the subject is the slaves, servi, soldiers, milites, men, viri, and mulieres, meaning women. So it's saying slaves, soldiers, men, and women were going back and forth. So it's explaining why there's such a huge crowd and such a chaotic time in the city. Then we have honora ingentia a servis portabantur, nam inter dio nihil intra urbem vehiculo portator. So honora ingentia is our subject, the huge loads or the huge burdens, right? It's neuter plural, which is why you have the onia ingentia, right? And they're portabantur, they were being carried. Again, you have passive voice. It's imperfect tense. You can tell by the BA. So you're saying the huge burdens of the huge loads were being carried. We need that ablative of aged again. It's a servis, by the slaves or by slaves. So they're carrying a bunch of stuff is the idea. Because or for, nam, interdiu means during the day, nihil, nothing, right? Nothing portator is carried inside the city, intra urbem. Vehiculo is ablative, by a vehicle, right? So it's saying that there's nothing being carried by vehicles in the city because, again, they're not allowed in the city during the day is the idea. So this is why you have slaves going around and carrying the huge burdens because you're not allowed to carry it by vehicle, right? Just a normal ablative with vehiculo. So then you keep going. You have omnia quae, videt Cornelia, eam delectant. So here's one of our QU words, right? Omnia quae. Omnia means everything here. It's the direct object, again, neuter. Quae means which. Again, it looks a little odd, but it's a neuter relative pronoun, right? It's accusative again, which is where you're going to see the QUAE, the quae. So it's saying everything which Cornelia sees, Cornelia videt, delights her, delectant eam. Eam just means her. So if you go back to the QU word, it's referring to omnia, right? Everything, right? So everything which, it's about to explain it's which Cornelia sees. It's accusative because you're saying Cornelia sees everything is kind of what you're getting at. So the QU word here makes sense as being a relative pronoun because it's neuter. It has the neuter antecedent. It just works together, right? So everything which she sees delights her. You have nunc conspicit, poetam versus recitantem, nunc mendicos pecuniam petentes, nunc lecticam elegantissimam, quae ab octo servis portator. So now, conspicit, she catches sight of. So it's describing all the things that are delighting her in the previous sentence. So now she catches sight of a poet reciting verses. Recitantem is a participle here. Just take it as a vocab word, reciting. And then you have your fourth declension noun, versus, right? Accusative plural. A poet reciting verses. So now she sees this. Nunc here, you can translate it now or almost then. It's just describing the sequence of what she sees. So now she's seeing, she catches sight of the poet reciting verses. Now she catches sight of, is the implied verb, the mendicos, the beggars, petentes pecuniam, looking for money. And now she catches sight of, again, the implied verb here, a lecticam elegantissimum, the most beautiful, most elegant lectica, that litter, that wealthy Romans would be carried in. A most beautiful or most elegant litter, which, again, we have a relative pronoun here because it's starting our relative clause. It's referring to the lectica, which is why it's feminine, but it's nominative here because in its own clause, it's acting as the subject. So you're saying which is being carried, portator, by 8 slaves. There's our ablative of agent. So again, how did I know the QU word here was a relative pronoun? Well, it's not part of a question. There's no exclamation point. It's not spelled quam or quote, so it's not one of our causal conjunctions or our adverb. It's a relative pronoun, right? It's just a normal feminine nominative singular relative pronoun. It's referring to our antecedent of lecticam, which is also feminine and singular. Remember, the relative pronoun gets its case and gender, its number and gender from the antecedent. Its case comes from what it's doing in the sentence. So in its own clause, you're saying which is being carried, which is your subject, which is why quae is nominative. So you're saying which is being carried by 8 slaves. Then you have in ea recumbit homo obesus qui librum leget. So in it, right, in the lectica, is reclining a homo obesus, the fat man, basically, who is reading a book. And again, in that sentence, we have a QU word. We have qui. Now, this is a relative pronoun. Again, the way you can tell, there's no exclamation point. There's no question mark. So it's not an interrogative pronoun. It's not an exclamatory adverb. It's not spelled quote, so it's not our causal conjunction. So we're down to either relative pronoun or indefinite adjective. And this does not have a DAM on the end of it. So it's not an indefinite adjective. So this is how you can kind of do process of elimination and realize it's a relative pronoun, which makes sense because it's referring to the homooubasis, the fat man, right? That's the antecedent. So since homooubasis is masculine singular, qui is masculine singular. So qui is nominative because, again, you get the case from what the relative pronoun is doing in its own clause. Qui is the subject of legate, who reads a book. So that's how you can kind of approach this to figure out that you're looking at a relative pronoun. Again, you'd still probably be able to translate it, so don't go too crazy. But if you're just trying to keep track in your head, this will help you with your translation. But the more you practice, the better off you're going to be. Now we can continue. We have subito Cornelia duo servos per viam festinantes conspicit, quorum alter porcum parvulum portat. So suddenly, Cornelia, there's our subject, conspicit, she catches sight of duo servos, two slaves. That's our direct object, the accusative plural. They're festinantes, hurrying through the road or along the road. Again, festinantes is another participle. Just pretend it's a vocab word, hurrying for now. And you'll kind of unpack what it's really doing later on. So she sees or catches sight of the two slaves hurrying through the road. Here we have another QU word. It's a relative pronoun. You can tell because it's got the comma in front of it. And again, if you were to go process of elimination, you realize relative pronoun is the only thing that makes sense. It's referring to the two slaves. So it's genitive plural. You're saying of whom, right? Meaning of the two slaves, alter, one, portat, is carrying a porcum parvulum, a little pig. So of those two slaves hurrying through the streets, one of them's carrying a pig. Then you have eo ipso tempore, e manibus effugit porcus. So at that very moment, eo ipso tempore, the pig, the porcus, effugit, it escapes or runs away out of the hands, e manibus. Manibus is a fourth declension noun, right? And it means out of the hands, really, of the slave, right? It escapes from the slave's hands, is the idea. You have cavete exclama ad stantes, sed frustra. So cavete is our plural imperative. It's positive, meaning you're ordering someone to do something. So the ad stantes, the bystanders, shout, they exclama. Cavete means watch out, be careful, right? They're commanding more than one person to do something, which is why you have the te on the end of cavete, right? So they shout out and they say, beware, watch out. Right? They're telling the crowd to watch out for the little pig. Sed frustra means but in vain, right? Frustra is ablative, but in vain, meaning it didn't matter, it was too late, is kind of the idea. Homo quidam, qui per viam celeriter currit, porcum vitare non potest. So homo quidam means a certain man or some man. Here's our indefinite adjective, quidam. It's a QU word, but you can tell by the DAM, it's going to be an indefinite adjective. It's describing the homo, the man, which is why they match in case, number, gender, right? Because it's an adjective. So a certain man, some man, again, it means that Cornelia doesn't know who it was. And it's really not important to the story, right? It doesn't really matter what this person's name was. It's just some guy, right? The guy who fell down, or who was about to fall down. So some guy, some man, qui, who, again, here we have another QU word, but it's a relative pronoun. You can tell because it's in a clause with commas around it. It's referring to the homo quidam. So some man who is running, currit, per viam celeriter, through the street quickly. So it's a relative clause. It's describing, giving more information about the homo quidam. It's not just any man, or any some man, you might say here. It's the one who's, running through the streets quickly. So the certain man or some man who is running through the streets quickly, non potest, is not able, vitare, to avoid. There's our complementary infinitive. He's not able to avoid the porcum, the pig. So the pig escaped. This guy wasn't able to avoid it. Ad terram cadet, he falls, meaning the homo quidam, the man falls ad terram, to the ground, right? He kind of either trips over the pig or he falls trying to avoid the pig, however you want to think of it. Polisper in luto jacet gemens. So for a short time, he lies. Jacet, by the way, is jacere, not jacere. So it's not talking about throwing, it's talking about lying down. So he lies for a short time in luto, in the mud. It's ablative because you're showing the position of where he is. He's just lying in the mud. Gemens is another participle. And again, you're going to see how these all work later on. It means groaning. It's describing the man, so it's nominative here. So groaning, the man lies in the mud for a short time, right? Because he tripped over the pig. Then you have dende, ira commota servum petit aqua porcus offugit, est rixa. So dende means then or next. Komotus is still describing the man, the homo quidam, the man who fell down. So the man moved, right? It means like emotionally moved. Ira is the ablative. It's explaining what he's moved by. He's moved by anger, right? He petted, he looks for the serum, the slave, meaning the one that, let the pig go, right? So he looks for the slave from whom, a quo, the porcus, the pig, ofugit, ran away or escaped. So he's looking for the person that the pig escaped from. A quo is another QU word. It's a relative pronoun. From whom? It's referring to the slave, right? The serum. That's the antecedent. But the sentence, the clause, is the pig escaped from whom, right? So that's why you have a quo here, right? It's ablative because he ran away from the slave is the idea. But again, another QU word, just a normal relative pronoun in a relative clause. So the man is moved by anger. He gets up and he's looking for this slave. Estrixa just means there's a quarrel, right? There's a fight because he's looking for the guy who made him trip is the idea. Finem rixai non videt Cornelia, quod servi iam celas and aliam viam tuleran. So Cornelia is the subject here. Non videt, she doesn't see, right, or didn't see the finem, the end, rixai, of the fight, genitive, right, the end of the fight. So Cornelia didn't see it. Then you have quod, because. Here is our causal conjunction. Right? How do we know this? Because the antecedent would probably be Cornelia, right? But Cornelia is feminine, and we said if quod is a relative pronoun, it needs to be neuter. There's no neuter word here for it to refer back to. Finem, rixa, none of these are neuter, so it can't be a relative pronoun. It's not referring back to anything. In other words, it has no neuter antecedent. So this is how we know it's a conjunction. It just means because. It's joining the two clauses together. The first thought is Aurelia didn't see the end of the fight. Now we have the second thought, because the slaves, the servi, tuleran, they brought, or they had carried, you could say, had brought her, the celas rather. So they had brought the chairs that they're in, the sedan chairs, into another road, right? Aliam viam. So it's saying she did not see because the slaves had brought. Again, think about the tenses here. Videt is perfect tense, tuleran is pluperfect. So you're saying the pluperfect happens first. So first, they brought her, or brought the sedan chairs, meaning the chairs that are carrying Cornelia and her mom. They brought her into another road, and then she did not see the end of the fight, right? It's kind of sequencing out what happened first. But again, the idea here for the QU word is quod has to be a conjunction. It can't be functioning as anything else. Then we have tandem, ad venerant, ad eam tabernam quam patebant. So finally, or at last, tandem, they arrived, perfect tense, ad venerant, they arrived, or they reached, they arrived at the shop, eam tabernam, that shop, you could say, or the shop, which they were looking for, right? Quam here is a relative pronoun. It's describing the tabernam. Right? It's not just any shop. You're giving more information. It's not that, just that they arrived at the shop. It's the shop which they were looking for, which they were seeking. Right? It's a relative pronoun. Then you have de celis, de scenderon. So they climbed, perfect tense, de celis, down from the sedan chairs, you could say. It's ablative plural because there's more than one chair, and de goes with the ablative, right? So they went down from the chairs. Tum Aurelia, vidistine inquit, illam lecticam inqua recumbebat homo obesis. So Aurelia is asking a question, right? So then Aurelia says, or asks, you could say, vidistine, did you see? So remember the any just means you're asking a yes or no question. So the verb here is vidisti, you saw, right? So did you see is kind of how we put it into a question. She's talking to Cornelia. She says, did you see that lectica, that litter, right? Illam is just referring to the lecticon. So did you see that litter? Again, it's demonstrative, so she's talking about something that's far away from her. In qua, in which, again, a relative pronoun, because you're about to describe the lectica. It's not just any litter, it's the one in which the homo obesus, the fat man, recumbebat, was reclining, right? So in qua here is just a normal relative pronoun. The relative clause is giving you more information about the lectica. Then you have unus e libertis caesaris ipsius, and then she gets interrupted. And she says, sed quid accidit, fumam video et flammas. So she starts by saying, unus e libertis, one of the slaves, right? And libertis, sorry, not slaves, the freedmen, meaning which a slave who's been set free. So she's saying he's one of the freedmen of Caesar himself. Caesaris ipsius is genitive. So she's describing the man by saying he's one of the freedmen of Caesar himself. And for reference, if this person was one of the freedmen of Caesar, of the emperor, the idea here is he could potentially be very wealthy, which might explain why he's a homo obesus, right? But he'd also be very important, right? To be a freedman of Caesar would be an important person, which might explain why he's walking, or not walking, he's being carried rather, in the most elegant, the elegantissimum lecticum, right? This really elaborate lectica. It all kind of comes together when Aurelia recognizes that he's one of the freedmen of Caesar. But in the middle of her thought, she gets interrupted and says, sed quid occidit, but what's happening, right? What's going on? So in other words, she gets distracted by something, right? And she said, and by the way, quid is the interrogative pronoun. So I know it doesn't quite start the sentence, but it's close enough. You just have but, right? But you could put quid at the beginning of the sentence because you're asking a question. What is happening, right? It's that interrogative pronoun. And she says, fumum video et flamma. So I see, video, smoke and flames. So she gets distracted because she sees that there's a building on fire, right? Which is going to set up the next chapter. She sees the smoke and the flames. So that's the story. Again, it's nothing too crazy in terms of the translation. The Latin is pretty straightforward. The thing you want to keep track of is really the QU words in this story. So they actually do a pretty decent job of giving you a variety of them, which is good. So every time you run into a QU word, because there's 5 kind of categories, 5 different options of what it could be, you want to just pause for a minute and think to yourself, what makes the most sense? There's some giveaways that once you memorize and kind of practice a lot, you'll recognize, like the DAM on an indefinite adjective. There's certain things that'll tell you, oh, it has to be this or it has to be that. More often than not, it usually is a relative pronoun, but it doesn't mean it has to be, right? There's a lot of different QU words you could run into, and that we've seen so far in Ecce. So as you read through, just pay attention to it. And again, this is why I always tell you to read the story out loud. You'll start hearing the QU words as you go, particularly when you're reading it aloud. And the more you practice this, the more you're going to recognize what they are in the context of the sentence. So try to just read each sentence, read it aloud for what it is, and you'll get the hang of what these QU words are. If you have any questions at all, again, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll help you however I can. But like I always say, the more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to be with these. So if you need to read the story a few times to really get the hang of it, that should be your goal. You should try to hit a point where you could read the story out loud and have a pretty good understanding of what's going on without having to stop every 2 minutes and kind of directly translate. Try to aim for more reading skills, and you'll get that the more you practice. Good luck.